We're very fortunate tonight to have as our moderator Jeb Sharp. I first heard Jeb Sharp when she was a reporter back in the mid-1990s on WBUR, and her reporting and stories were always clear and intelligent. And then she went to work for a show that is one of the real gems on public radio, the show The World, which in this area is on every weeknight from 4 to 5 on WGBH. It's a great show. If you haven't listened to it, I encourage you to do it, and you'll hear Jeb's excellent reporting on international affairs as well as reports from many other folks. So with that, let me turn it over to Jeb Sharp for what I know is going to be a really great evening. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Warren. Test this mic out that I'm wearing. Okay. No, thank you very, very much, Warren. And good evening and welcome to the Forum on Energy and National Security. And welcome to all the panelists who've come from various places and flown across country in one case to get here on time. And I will introduce them. Starting to my right is Chris Flavin, president of the World Watch Institute. He's written widely on energy policy with a focus on renewables, electricity restructuring, and the potential for hydrogen. To my far right, Joel Gordis, who was on the panel last year. He graduated from the U.S. Air Force Academy and has spent nearly 3 decades working on energy problems with a focus on conservation, renewables, and global climate change and its implications. To my left, Bill Holmberg. Bill Holmberg won a Navy Cross for his service in the Korean War, among many other honors. We're honored to have you, and has decades of experience in the energy field. His focus, too, has been on conservation and efficiency, with a particular interest in biorefineries, and we will grill you on that. We can explore that tonight. And finally, Jeff Tester, professor of chemical engineering here at MIT, former director of MIT's Energy Laboratory. He's also worked at Los Alamos and served on numerous national and presidential committees related to energy. And he's also the author of a brand new textbook on sustainable energy. So again, thank you all for your time. Thanks for being here. And I just wanted to start out. I mean, as Warren has said, I work in a newsroom. So I did a quick wire search before I left today. And it was just so obvious how apt this topic was. Oil jumped $1 a barrel today. There was another news item from the Associated Press saying that the Bush administration is 1 vote away from getting what it wants in the Senate in terms of drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The rest of the news, of course, was about Security Council negotiations in New York about Iraq. And there were ongoing speculations all day about where Osama bin Laden was, whether he was going to be caught, which just sort of brought September 11th right back. And it just was so clear to me that all of these are related to energy and national security questions. And I would love it if the panelists can kind of connect the dots a little bit, start off with just a minute or two on their headlines on this topic. I don't want to take anything for granted, especially in a public forum. What essentially is the issue here, and what do each of you kind of consider your most urgent priorities? And I will just hand it to Chris Flavin to start off with that and get us started.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Jeb. It's a pleasure to be here this evening with all of you. I do want to thank the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association for not only sponsoring tonight's event, but also the important conference that begins tomorrow morning. I think could not be a more timely opportunity to discuss these issues. I think a good place to start is how is today's world different from where we were 10 years ago? Jeb just noted that the price of oil is almost exactly what it was on the eve of the Gulf War, or what we may soon call the first Gulf War. But I think other than that simple number, a lot has changed, and unfortunately it's changed in a direction that's not terribly positive. World oil consumption is now a full 10 million barrels a day higher than it was a decade ago. It's gone from 66 million barrels a day to roughly 76 million barrels a day. During much of that period, we have sort of given up on the conservation ethic and the efficiency efforts that had marked the previous decade, which of course had followed earlier oil crises. We're in a situation now where the overall world oil market is much tighter than it was a decade ago. I think that's the fundamental thing to keep in mind. There's a tendency to talk about oil price crises in terms of, people being worried about war, the markets being fearful, the crisis in Venezuela, what's happened in terms of, particular accidents at refineries and so on. And all of those kinds of things do on a, daily, weekly, and monthly basis affect the price of oil. But underlying that, you've got the question of how much spare capacity there is in the world. And there's probably only about 2 to 3% excess capacity available, essentially all of it sitting in the Persian Gulf, and much of it at least potentially at risk in the event of war. That compares with over 7% spare capacity that existed back in the late 80s and early 90s, which was the reason that producers were able to quickly respond and deal with a crisis. We are now a decade closer to the ultimate peak in world oil production, which according to many estimates is probably within about 15 years away. And we're also at a point where almost all of the net remaining potential to expand production is in the Middle East. Now, there is some potential in areas like the Caspian, also in offshore Africa, South America, to expand production. But that will essentially be offset by declines in production in the U.S., the North Sea, and other relatively stable areas. So we're now heading towards a future in which the fact that 2/3 of the world's remaining oil lies in the Middle East is going to become increasingly apparent in terms of market power and in terms of the stability of the market. And I would argue that we are in for a period where we're unlikely to see the kind of stability of oil prices that we've seen throughout much of the 80s and 90s. That's basically history at this point. And as long as the overall political situation in the Middle East is stable, prices can be stable or perhaps even decline at times. But I think that we are at a point where any minor hiccup politically or militarily in that part of the world is going to create a very dangerous situation. So I think that I just wanted to lay out those sort of basic starting thoughts. In my mind, there is a need for a real sense of urgency in terms of reducing dependence on oil, which is ultimately the only way that we are going to provide for additional stability in the world economy. It is just a simple fact of history that every recession that we've had in the last 30 years has been preceded by a rise in oil prices. We are very vulnerable, we're very dependent, and we just happen to be in a situation where the part of the world that is the central linchpin to the world oil market is the least politically stable part of the world. And I think it's probably, among all of the things that are virtually impossible to predict today, I think that one thing seems highly likely, and that is regardless of whether there's a war and regardless of the precise outcome of the war, we're unlikely to see a reincarnation of Switzerland in the Middle East anytime soon.
Joel.
Thank you, Jeb, and it's good to be back here and have you hammering us with the questions there. And the only way I'm to the far right of you here is physically, I should say. I concur a great deal with what Chris has said in relation to the oil situation. And again, the idea of drilling in the Anwar, where they're only one vote away from that, gives no solace to us of that is going to be any form of panacea. It's important to understand that the geologists, not the politicians, the geologists basically say there's about a 5% chance that you're going to have 12 billion barrels. And there's about a 95% chance that you're going to have 3 billion barrels. However, the pertinent number involved is we use about 7 billion barrels per year. So you're going to have between, a half a year and a year and a half worth of oil coming from that particular spot. The only thing it does is keeps the addiction going. And as Chris implied, with the Persian Gulf having 2/3 of the world's reserves available, one way or the other, you are going to be back there for Desert Storm or Persian Gulf War 2, 3, 4, whatever. Because even if we, quote unquote, win, we lose. We may destabilize certain governments. My fondest dream to see democratization over there even has great peril. And there are reasons maybe we'll get into later on that. However, my other concern is domestically the vulnerability of our centralized electric and gas distribution systems, how vulnerable we are, how fragile they are, and the dangers that holds for us. So hopefully we'll be able to get into some of that as well.
Great, thank you. Bill Holmberg.
I'd like to focus on the solutions to the problem. You're going to hear a lot. Chris has done a great job in laying out the potential problems. But I'd like to go back to my days in World War II. I don't think too many of you were around in that time. But we called ourselves, and I was just a kid then, obviously, we called ourselves Home Front Patriots. And we did everything we could think of. As kids, we were salvaging string and cans and aluminum foil, and there was rationing of food and gasoline. Everybody got involved in this thing in a very serious way. And here we are on the brink of a potential energy crisis, and most of us don't have much to do about this thing other than worry about the circumstances. And what I'm suggesting is that renewable energy and energy efficiency has the answer to these problems. We can, in fact, greatly reduce our dependence on imported oil, improve our security here in this country and around the world. America can set the pace. We can show the world with our great science and technology that we don't have to be dependent on fossil fuels. And I think hope we can get into this very deeply during this discussion.
Thank you. And Jeff.
Okay. One of the things, first of all, I'd like to thank also the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association for putting this event on and for inviting me. And I can't help but relate this back to this course that we've been teaching for some years here that we entitled Sustainable Energy, because we wanted to see how students as well as the faculty involved might define this term. One of the things we've learned, and I'm sure you can share this, is that there's no simple definition. This is very much a multi-dimensional problem with different value systems reflecting on where we might want to transition to. We've heard some discussion so far this evening about our dependence on oil and its relationship to the world and the availability and somewhat maldistribution, let's say, of oil and gas resources, and also about our own infrastructure. And I think we should take a very careful look at what's happening in this country versus what's happening in the rest of the world. We've seen early warnings already in California where energy demand outstrips supply and a capacity of our electric power transmission and distribution system is unable to deliver power when and where it's needed. There are other indicators that should light up warning signals in some of the political centers of the world. Our own capacity for providing electric power from some important non-fossil resources is declining. We haven't placed an order for a new nuclear plant in over 25 years. And there is no new nuclear generating capacity to meet increasing demands. Our hydropower capacity, at one time a giant player in the country, still an important supplier of electricity, is declining as well. Concerns over the environmental impacts on aquatic ecosystems, watersheds, etc. The events of September 11th reminded us again of the vulnerability of our infrastructure. And I think it suggests that a different path, one perhaps that reflects on the diversity of our own people and products that have made this a strong country, the richness of our natural resources that go well beyond coal and oil, and the abundance of low-cost fossil energy that we've appreciated so much for many, many years. I think adding to that diversity is going to be important, and thinking about a path to get there even more important. So increasing energy security can occur in lots of ways. Decreasing our dependence on foreign oil, many people have talked about that. Increasing the diversity of our indigenous energy supplies, not only renewables but other supplies as well, and strengthening and diversifying our energy distribution system. We certainly are going to be, for a lot of reasons, probably leaving the age of hydrocarbons, as Chris and others have talked about. But we may be entering a new age that we might call carbon management. And carbon management means a lot of things to some people. There's a lot of coal in America, and if we could figure out a way to burn this more in a manner which we might be able to control the emissions of carbon dioxide, either by sequestration or other techniques, this might allow us to use that resource in a more sustainable manner. We also have to do a better job on nuclear fuels if they're going to play a role. And the costs associated with many of the alternatives, some of which are favorites of people around this table, including solar and wind, biomass, geothermal, and others, all have to become better in terms of their competitiveness with the other existing options. This is a tall order. We hope we can address some of these issues tonight, so thank you.
Great. No, that helps a lot. I think given what you've all said, the big picture that you've drawn, the desire to look at the solutions, the desire for the solutions to fit into big picture thinking, and yet we're faced with proposals such as drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. There's this sort of immediate versus long term. We're maxed out. We need oil for the current way we live. Do you all agree with Joel that drilling in the Arctic Refuge is just a non-starter, or are those some of the difficult short-term political questions? Jeff Tester mentions nuclear. You know, these are all sort of uncomfortable topics in a forum like this, but first let's deal with that. Before we go to the utopias, how do each of you kind of conceive dealing with and also you're dealing with people in Washington, for instance, the Senate, looking at the Arctic with other pressures, the war pressures, et cetera. Maybe you should start, Jeff, how you feel about the refuge and how should we think about it in this context?
ANWR is a very interesting place. I don't know how many people in this room have actually been there, but I have been there. And if the operations on the North Slope of Alaska have improved a lot over the years in terms of their local environmental impact, for sure. We're just better at it now. We know we made a lot of mistakes. We know how to do it better. But the real question, I think the fundamental question, is that the highest priority item that we should be focusing on for either development of our own fossil fuel supplies from that region. One thing that strikes me about the whole area of northern Alaska is that there's a lot of natural gas now that's been reinjected into the system there as a sustained way of maintaining pressure in the oil and gas reservoirs. To my knowledge, perhaps a more higher priority issue might be putting in a separate pipeline to bring natural gas down to the lower 48. That doesn't seem to play as high in terms of the political capital, but it could have a much bigger impact in terms of a lower carbon to hydrogen fuel, something that we certainly can use in this country if we're going to generate more of our electricity with natural gas or supply it in this way. It seems to not, the discussion of priorities doesn't seem to be going on. Furthermore, I certainly believe that the uncertainty of how much oil might come out of the system in terms of ANWR versus the existing North Slope development is a real question. Exploration might be one way to answer that, but even if it is able to produce oil to maintain the flow in the existing Trans-Alaska pipeline, it still is a small fraction of what we even need in our own country. We're approaching 20 million barrels a day or so in terms of consumption, and this would at the most, given the amount of time to develop the infrastructure, would produce 1 million or so barrels a day in a most optimistic scenario if you listen to the operators who are up there. So it's not going to solve our imported oil problem. It may ease some of it for a while, but it's not necessarily worth the risk.
I agree with you on that, Jeff. The amount of oil that might be available there, even according to the more optimistic projections, is not going to really significantly change the overall supply-demand balance in the U.S. We will actually lose more production from Alaska and other sources before that could come online, so that we will actually be in a worse position, even if it is developed. I think the other thing to focus on in terms of what would really make a difference in improving the U.S. energy situation is to realize that our vulnerability is really expressed economically. And as long as we are very heavily dependent on oil, particularly in our transportation, and the question of exactly where the marginal amount is coming from, that is, are we getting, how much of it are we getting from Alaska, versus Venezuela versus Nigeria versus Saudi Arabia, actually doesn't make that big a difference, because if prices jump because demand is outrunning supply and you have a crisis in the Middle East, we all pay that price. And I don't know how much better it makes you feel to know that your money is going, to Venezuela, or maybe to Exxon, that's operating some overseas, non-OPEC oil, or even whether it's going to Texas. The economic impact in terms of the shock to the U.S. economy is the same. So the thing we really need to do if we want to lower our vulnerability is to reduce the amount of oil we consume. If we became more efficient, reduced the amount that we require, and diversified into other fuels, into biofuels, into hydrogen, perhaps into natural gas, that would really make a difference in terms of taking pressure off the market and also making us less vulnerable to an oil shock. But short of that, slightly shifting the balance around between countries really doesn't make a difference.
And yet, just to follow up, the oil companies are going to keep looking for places to drill, right? And we have to make policy decisions about where they drill. Because, what you're saying is there's a huge world market, and it operates on market principles. So as a country, presumably, we're having to make decisions about. In other words, is the decision about the Arctic or any other ecologically sensitive place, or any place at all anyway, just not the issue?
Well, those decisions have to be made. We get a lot of our oil at it's a growing share now from the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah. And we've made a decision as a country to allow extensive oil drilling there into very deep water. On the other hand, there is very little drilling off the coast of California because of a feeling that it's simply not worth the risk. There's a bit of a mixed result in Florida, but we're, I think, all familiar with the sort of family discussion that went on at that point, where George Bush was in favor of drilling, and his brother, who has the responsibility of representing the citizens of Florida, was against it. And I think increasingly we live in a world where a lot of people feel that there are areas that are so valuable, either for fish or for natural amenities, that they should be left out of bounds. But I think the bottom line in the U.S. is that even if we were to open up all of those environmentally sensitive areas, it really wouldn't make a huge difference.
Okay. So go ahead. I was going to move to you and the solutions. Is that you're going to? I want to know, given how maxed out we are, what's the next viable solution to shoot for?
Let me make the point first, if I may. That I think Jeff is absolutely right. We need to get that gas pipeline going and get it going tomorrow. In terms of drilling in Anwar, I think we'd all agree that it's not a very good idea. But if you walk the hills of Congress in Washington, D.C., you can see that if you somebody says, well, maybe we can help you with this energy efficiency and this renewable energy legislation, but how do you feel about Anwar? And you got to be very careful to not walk into that trap. So I think it's probably a foregone conclusion that in all probability something will happen up there in Anwar. But then getting back to what can we do about it, as I see the world, there's basically three big power structures going on. One is the fossil industries, the multi-world fossil industries, and then the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us. And the third thing is patriotism. Those of us that are dedicated to the kinds of things we're talking about, there's not a heck of a lot we can do trying to interface with the multinational fossil fuel industry or the military-industrial complex. The only lever that's available to us is this issue of patriotism. And I'm going to keep beating that drum all night.
And relate that issue of patriotism to your own work. To the quest for solutions, for workable solutions to the problem of energy security.
Well, if there was a Manhattan Project, if the president, for example, put all the renewable energy and energy efficiency things in the same light he put hydrogen, and made a Manhattan Project out of this problem that we have would go away in 15 or 20 years, no question about it.
So it's funding, focus, energy, political will.
It's a political will. If the political will is there to do it, we can do it, and the political will not be there, until the American people determine that it's there. It has to be ordered in from the bottom up.
What is then politically feasible tomorrow, next week, next month? I mean, what do you work on?
What's politically feasible is, instead of spending money, and we do spend even in times when we are not having an imminent conflict, $50 billion or more per year just to be ready to go into the Middle East. That's how much I don't have my view graph on this today, but I did have this in Washington a year ago. So there's $50 billion, actually it's $57 billion from the Center for Defense Information. Okay? Next to that, you look at the renewable energy budget of the United States Department of Energy, which the total budget for them is about $17 billion, of which 10 of it is nuclear on the weapons management, leaving about $7 billion for energy, the majority of which is fossil fuel. And as you go down the curve, you find that the actual renewable budget is $345 million. On a bar graph next to a $57 billion bar, it's equal with the x-axis. You cannot see it. Therefore, the priorities are, dare I say this to my very good friend, Colonel Holmberg, our energy policy is send in the Marines, very literally. So I think we have to shift the priorities and say, when we are looking very much at our national sovereignty, because who has the fossil fuel, the high concentration, high energy per gallon oil, that we are facing some dire circumstances.
I guess what I meant when I said what's politically feasible is that's the dire picture in terms of what you folks would like to see happen and what's reality. But given that picture, which chunk do you bite off, or which particular technology do you chase? What has the most promise in terms of, if we're or give us a big picture sense of, are you saying, Jeff, we have to change the whole picture?
Well, I think we have to change our attitude a little bit about time scales. This is a problem that spans generations, not to mention just political terms. And we have a difficult time with that. I think the political system has a difficult time addressing that. To me also, as I was directed MIT's Energy Lab, had the privilege of directing it for a dozen years, and therefore I must embrace all forms of energy, whether they're in the form of electrons or neutrons or protons or photons or whatever. But the point is, the one thing I learned from this is that there's a lot of misinformation that's out there about potential solutions, and there's a lot of misinformation about existing energy systems that we have. We have to do things better. Certainly, that's deeply embedded in an institution like MIT is the performance of a system in terms of its engineering performance or other metrics that we might have to meet. And much of that has happened. If we look at fossil fuel, the way we convert and extract, convert fossil fuel to various types of energy services is much more efficient now than it was. Certainly electricity is a good example of that. The environmental impacts are down from what they were several decades ago. But unfortunately, we're still growing our demand. So to me, we should be taking a much closer look at matching the resources that we have, the indigenous resources that we have, that are not just fossil resources, that are spread parts of the Southwest where we have very high direct solar insolation, areas of the country where wind is a high-grade resource, whether it's onshore or offshore, in the plains of North Dakota. Crops now, or parts of crops that we don't consume as food that we might burn on fields or leave to rot on fields. And a lot of the other forms, for one reason or another, tend to be downplayed. Geothermal is a good example. We could talk about that at more length if you want to, but certain parts of the country are well endowed, let's say, in high-grade hydrothermal resources, and they're not being developed perhaps at a rate which is consistent with that grade.
Can I interrupt for a second? Are those things that you feel are completely overlooked now? We have all this potential and no one's really talking about it?
Well, I think this is a very good point to bring up, because it gets back to, at the front end of this sort of multidimensional problem is the R&D portfolio and the way we fund it. But we can't forget that even with technologies that we might have that are ready to be deployed, they may require sort of intervention in some way to bring deployment along, because the competition is stiff with world commodities and things like that. The price of oil, in spite of an increase of $1 a barrel, is still a pretty big bargain. One of the things we use in class when we talk to our students about oil versus other things we use is bring in a bottle of Poland Spring water, a liter of it. Think about what that costs when you go and buy it on the market. It's essentially tax-free, by the way. And then compare that with a similar volume of gasoline. It's still an incredible difference in price, even in today's markets. And we have to understand that perhaps the value of some of these fossil fuels is not really fully reflected in the price we pay, nor are some of the environmental damages that might be associated with it. So there's a mismatch between price and cost, and I think we've got to take a different view on this. And it may not be just taxes. It's a more, let's say, longer range view.
Let's pick up on both. You've given us a lot. But first, Chris, you wanted to respond to the potential of indigenous resources?
I actually wanted to go back to your question, Jeb, because I thought it was the right question, which is what is politically feasible? And I think that there are really two answers to that. I think at the national level right now, very little is possible except, maybe drilling for oil in a national treasure in Alaska. That is possible. The reason that's possible is that there are basically a handful of oil companies that own the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and that they're rapidly depleting the resources that are up there. They just want to keep that asset going until it finally breaks apart. And so they've got an obvious economic motivation, and they clearly have the voice of they have the ear of a sufficient number of senators and congressmen that it appears likely that it is going to pass this time around. There's a saying, this is my favorite saying going around Washington these days, which is that the idea of diversity in the Bush administration is to have a president and a vice president from two different oil companies. And I think you could say the same for a good part of the Congress as well. The large entrenched energy industries have unprecedented amounts of political power right now at a very time when their actual importance to the U.S. economy has dramatically declined. I mean, the relative share of fossil fuels in the overall U.S. economy is lower than it's been at any time in the last 50 years. But through a combination of political circumstances, they're very powerful in Washington. Now, the good news is at the state level, where I think an awful lot is politically possible now. And the basic equation is this. Relatively few of our 50 states have significant, major fossil fuel industries that really are powerful both economically and politically within the states. And so if the question is how do you strengthen the local economy, it's by developing indigenous energy resources within those states, which in most cases are renewables. They are mainly some combination of wind power, bioenergy, and solar energy. A few states also have geothermal, but it's primarily those three. And I think the opportunity that I sense is being increasingly recognized in many states is that energy can become not just a drain on a state economy where you're basically shipping your money off to either Texas or the Middle East to get your energy supply, but it's actually creating local businesses, local jobs. It is reviving the agricultural sector where a lot of both the bioenergy and the wind energy exist. And I think there's a new political equation coming into place, and I think it's not just hypothetical. I can see it happening already in at least a dozen or so states where things are really happening. The most interesting recent example, and it was a surprise to me, I did a 2-day speaking tour of 7 towns in southern Vermont recently. And we had turnouts in these tiny little towns ranging from 50 to 150 at these little meetings that lasted an hour or two to discuss renewable energy prospects. And the reason that people were so engaged in coming out in the cold and snow to talk about this issue was because for them it's much more than a hypothetical option in the future. There are 7 substantial wind farm projects that are either in planning or under development in Vermont, and local communities are wrestling with the question of do they want to encourage that development? What would it mean aesthetically, economically, in terms of tourism? Things are really happening, and it's not just in California, not just in the states where we're used to seeing leadership. It's happening in Texas, it's happening in Massachusetts, it's happening in Vermont, it's happening in West Virginia, it's happening in some cases in the backyard of the fossil fuel industries.
Anybody want to respond to that?
I think it's important to recognize that Texas, for example, is now a net oil importer. The situation is changing rapidly. Also want to make the point that Chris brought up that geothermal isn't every place, but to a certain extent it is. For example, a lot of the military installations now around the country are going into geothermal heat pumps and making very significant energy savings. I also want to touch on the point that Jeff made. For we in the biomass world, we've got to go huggy up to the fossil fuels. For example, I talked to a person today out in Pennsylvania that has got a $100 million grant from the Department of Energy to develop clean coal technology, including the sequestration of CO2. And I said, well, why don't we co-fire? You've already got 2 coal-fired power plants. Why don't we co-fire with biomass and sort of get started out there? He said, well, that's a pretty good idea. And I said, when then you gasify the chum, they're using what is called chum out there, which is coal that is not marketable. You're gasifying that, and the next plan is to liquefy that. Take the synthesis gas through a catalytic process and turn it into a middle distillate like diesel fuel. And I said, what about loading some biomass into that gasifier, and so you come out with biodiesel? He says, that's a good idea. Come out and talk about it. Well, there's lots of examples like that where we can take advantage of the existing energy infrastructure and the existing fossil resources and start to wean them away over to the hydrocarbon concept that Chris is talking about.
Is there anywhere that's really taken off already, where you almost see a transformation happening? Or is it still nipping at the edges of the old world?
Missing at the edges of the old world. Co-gasification is just beginning to emerge. I think it's important to recognize that during World War II, the Germans used the Fischer-Tropsch system. So this isn't new stuff. It's been around a long time. Just recently, we started to take natural gas and run it through the catalytic process and produce aviation fuel, gasoline, diesel, etc. There's a wonderful amount of technology out there. As I said earlier, we're not restrained by science and technology. We're restrained by political will, and we're not going to get that political will unless we do what Chris says, is get to the states, get to the community, and really start marshaling the people to do what can be done.
Go ahead.
Let me bring up a concern here, too. And for those who are sometimes on the Nessie chat pages and stuff, I probably have brought it up there a few times. And a lot of this technology, indeed, has been developed for, quote-unquote, clean coal. The problem here is when you talk about cleaning up the coal, stripping the hydrogen out, and then sequestering the carbon portion, is when you talk to the people who are envisioning this, people like Bob Williams down at Princeton, people like Alan Hoffman at DOE, at least he has been at DOE, Victor Durr at DOE, and places like this, they're going to tell you there are still some very basic engineering and science problems in doing all this. That's number one. And the point is, if you take that route and you do it for coal, you may be spending so much of your R&D dollars that you have very little left to look at other promising things, and you need this diversity. Without that diversity, you're putting all your eggs in the one basket. Also, at the same time you are doing that, you are further centralizing your energy systems, which leaves you more vulnerable, since we are talking about the energy security aspects of it. I'll make one other point here, too, and that is, down in Washington a year ago when we were first talking about the energy security thing, somebody said, oh, all these things, these solutions that you're getting, they're wonderful. How come this isn't happening? I said, I got 3 words for you. The 3 words are campaign, finance, reform. Okay? Let's get to the root of it. Same thing happens. So let's get to the root By the way, I'm a former politician, too, okay? You're never former.
Can I pick up on this point about technologies and what's reachable, reasonable, achievable? Can you all respond to President Bush's hydrogen initiative? Help the layperson understand that. Is it viable? Is it? You want to go ahead, and then we're going to go to Jeff.
I just happened to have an email I brought that addressed this to my friend John Schneble, who was the founder of NESE. And basically, what I observed for the Bush plan for hydrogen with fuel cells was $1.2 billion is a pittance compared to what is needed. And actually, it was just an addition of funds, not huge amounts of additions. The forthcoming war in the Middle East could cost from $100 billion to $200 billion, put it into perspective. Using the gas turbine as a model. The gas turbine was developed over many, many years, going from about a 3% electrical efficiency up to today about 60% if one looks at the ABB product. That was through huge amounts of not just subsidy put into R&D, but military procurement that first gave us the fighters, the bombers, then later in the early 60s, airliners, and finally today, those hugely efficient power plants. Then the question is putting it into purely R&D, which is what he is doing. There's always been a certain amount of R&D funds. What's missing often is what's called in development the valley of death, and that's early commercialization funding. So you need that as part of the package, and that's not there. So those are some of it. The other thing is he's looking at it at transportation. In order to be practical for transportation, it has to cost approximately $90 per kilowatt. Right now, the cost is about $4,500 per kilowatt. Somewhere on the way down, the industry has to finance itself somewhere at around $1,500 per kilowatt, using it for stationary power rather than going all the way trying to hit 90. So those are some of the problems with the Bush plan.
Do you agree with that, Jeff?
Well, I have a somewhat different take. But
and remember that to the layperson, this sounds like a good thing, money towards a clean alternative.
If you take it at face value, or even step back from it and look at the initial rollout of the national energy policy, and you read the words in it, and it sounds good. We all need reliable, affordable, environmentally sound energy for America's future. And now we have hydrogen as being one of the elements, let's say, of the solution. It's the execution of this plan and the details of that execution that everybody should be carefully looking at. We live in a time now where national budgets are very important, and how that portfolio is played out, it's not necessarily $1.2 billion of new money. What seems to be playing out now from the OMB and the various markups in Congress is that it's a redistribution of the under-supported R&D that we have in place already. So in fact, not only might it not be just a zero-sum game, it could actually be a slightly negative-sum game because of the confusion that it introduces into the existing structure that we have now for this R&D. I don't think, if you were to talk to some of the program managers at the DOE now, I think you would see they are honestly confused as to how all of this is going to happen. Bioenergy, solar, wind, and some of the other renewable systems, as well as energy efficiency, all depend on this same area of the DOE for their, let's say, their annual budgets. And so it's not clear that it will be a net gain. That's the first thing. And also, it doesn't appear to me to have a real destination to it. I mean, it seems to me that if we're going to have a national energy policy like, let's say, analogous to going to the moon or something like that, it should be more clearly stated, I think, in terms of where we're headed. Is it energy independence, or is it trying to reduce imported oil by a certain amount, trying to achieve some sort of carbon-free energy or whatever it might be? Because it's not going to have a single path. And hydrogen, we have to keep in mind, hydrogen is not a new source of energy at all. It's an energy carrier. And most of the hydrogen that we produce today comes from fossil fuels and will probably be that way for at least some period of time until we can do some of the things that Bill's talking about, till we could use non-fossil sources for either electrolyzing water or splitting water in some way. That's the ultimate solution, but it's going to take a while to get there. We need a transition plan, but it shouldn't be at the sacrifice of our existing sort of underfunded, I would say, R&D program that we have.
How would you describe the way energy policy is stated?
Well, I think that, I mean, again, the current policy that we have, I think the goals are laudable. I mean, if you listen to it, a lot of what's said in that original policy statement, a long document, I don't think there are many of us around this table would disagree with it. It's how they actually are executing it. Where are the resources being applied? Let me give you a couple of examples of this. The Commission on National Security in 2001 recommended doubling the federal R&D budget to help address critical national security challenges. Has this really happened? I also was a member, had a privilege of being a member of the PCAST study that looked at the R&D portfolio some years ago. Now, there has been some good that's come out of that. I won't say that it has been absence of some good, but in terms of addressing the total amount, the total volume, let's say, research R&D that's supporting this, improving the portfolio and our options, it hasn't really changed that much. It's still about the same number. I think it's a little higher than 300 million, but some people might place it, if you looked at the whole thing, around $1 billion, but it's about half of probably what it should be. And I think that's still the case. So I'm more looking at the details of the execution. I'm sure Chris and others have other comments, but
I think Chris had a comment.
Yeah.
I agree with a lot of the concerns and skepticism about the Bush initiative, which they're calling Freedom Car. I'm still trying to figure out if it's also related to the Freedom Fries they're now serving for lunch in the U.S. Capitol. But I think that while those criticisms are certainly apt, that I think we're missing a bigger picture here, which is that I think that hydrogen does make sense, and I think this is a rare instance where we've got a pretty broad political consensus on a key part of the energy system. And the last time I can remember a broad consensus of this sort was when we sort of woke up to energy efficiency in the late 70s and early 80s. And I think that provides a real opportunity. Now, a lot of my environmentalist friends were quite upset and basically denounced hydrogen when Bush said he was for it. And the basic sense was that, well, if Bush is for it, it must be terrible, and there must be, some kind of a hidden agenda here. And they were probably right. I mean, I noticed, too, that hydrogen has been thought of as the way you get sunshine into the gas tank. It is an energy carrier, but it is the way you can turn renewable energy into something that is not intermittent, that can be stored, that you can put in your automobile or bus or even jet airplane and use it for transportation. So it has been supported by those who favor a, quote, sustainable energy future. But the day after Bush came out with his announcement, the National Coal Association put out a press release warmly welcoming this program. And there's no question but that a large part of the Bush agenda is to basically use coal ultimately as the source of hydrogen. There also are even some diehards that think that nuclear might be feasible. We may even have one of them on the panel here this evening, Jeff. But I'm perfectly ready to let the market decide these questions. The key thing is we have consensus about the idea that hydrogen makes sense, that we need a new energy carrier to replace gasoline. Ultimately, some combination of markets and policy decisions will determine what the combination of energy sources are that will actually provide that fuel. I share Joel's skepticism that coal is really ultimately going to prove economically feasible to do this. It reminds me, when hydrogen-powered cars, fuel cell cars, first became something that the auto companies were focusing on about 5 years ago. Virtually all of the major auto companies said they were going to use onboard reformers, that they were going to use put methanol in the car and reform it into hydrogen. We in the environmental community didn't like that because it tends to be dirty. Methanol itself is a pollutant, gets into drinking water, etc. They said, oh no, we can solve these problems. This will be much more economical than trying to store hydrogen. Well, we now have, I think, 3 major auto companies now have limited numbers of cars on the market, mainly in California and Japan, and not a single one of them uses a reformer. They all use direct hydrogen, and the reason is that it's a lot cheaper to store hydrogen in a pressurized tank than it is to put an oil refinery essentially into a car. And I have a feeling that, I mean, there's some basic thermodynamics when it comes to something like, taking the carbon out of coal and, sticking it underground and all of the infrastructure and cost involved. The simplest, cleanest way to go is with renewables. And yes, we have a long ways to go in terms of the economics. But if you look at the fact that solar and wind are already growing at 30% a year, and you have this new consensus about hydrogen, plus all the public opinion polls show that that's much what people prefer. People do not want to get their hydrogen from nukes and coal and all of that. If you're going to invest in this very expensive new technology, you have to have some politically agreed goal in mind, and having a sustainable, renewable-based energy system is something that the majority of people support. We're all concerned that it's too expensive, but all of that requires is further market development. I want to make one more point on this whole hydrogen issue and what Bush is doing. Joel is absolutely right. The amount of money that is being put in by the administration is peanuts. It's not significant. It will not drive that market. It is not going to really move the market. They are shifting money out of the renewables budgets. The point is the political signal that's being given by even the Bush administration supporting hydrogen. Already today, there is at least 10 times as much private money going into fuel cells as there is government money. And I think that gap, if anything, is going to widen over time. So the key thing is the direction the government is pointing in. I don't expect to get anything out of the actual Freedom Car program.
No, that's very interesting. Do you want to take up the nukes? It's about 8 o'clock, and I'd like to open it up to the audience, but it is a good one. I mean,
I don't think we're that far in disagreement. First, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that hydrogen isn't something we should invest in, but I think we have to be careful. I don't know whether this is attributed to Niels Bohr or to Yogi Berra, but making predictions is difficult, particularly if it's about the future. And perhaps this is a time where we might want to still keep options open. This transition to a hydrogen infrastructure is going to take a long time. We have amazing momentum and inertia in the system we have now in the way we supply gas, gasoline, natural gas, etc. So it will require perhaps some strange alliances, perhaps with fossil energy producers for a while to make hydrogen. But ultimately, I think the solution has to come from renewable type resources. To get there, though, we still need the infrastructure. We still have to be able to supply hydrogen, distribute it for automobiles, for trucks, in homes, and things like that. So we still need a lot of the features of a larger distribution system that we have in place now. And I think that could be addressed almost independently of where the hydrogen comes from. I do agree with Chris that onboard reforming is particularly challenging. I'm a chemical engineer, and everyone's dream is to have an automobile that also is a refinery at the same time. And that's basically what you have when you have a reformer on board. But there are challenges to the storage of hydrogen on board vehicles in terms of range, carrying around high-pressure hydrogen, the refueling aspects to it. So they have to all be looked at, I think. I don't think we know all the solutions yet. But I also don't think we're really investing in an aggressive enough fashion to get there over that kind of time frame either. And that's what I'm most concerned about. On the nuclear side, it's absolutely clear that we've learned a lot of lessons and have made some mistakes in the past about the way in which we've deployed nuclear power. But there are some features to power systems like that. For one, we're talking about a carbon-free source of energy, which may be very important for not only generating electricity, but also for producing hydrogen. But it also has the scale that might be more compatible with the kind of refineries that we have in place right now, where we produce hundreds of thousands of barrels of refined product in one location and then distribute it. That's a little hard for me to envision in the way in which we might distribute renewable energy, which is much more diverse and is naturally so because of the nature of the resource. So maybe there are some win-win combinations where you could live with both types of systems. I just don't think we know yet. So I'm for keeping options open at this stage.
Bill?
Just a couple of footnotes. Chris mentioned the hydrogen budget coming out of the other renewables.
Right.
We took a pretty big whack in the FY 2004 budget in biofuels because that money went over to hydrogen. There's another side to that coin. When some of our industries are now going to the financial community to get funding to build facilities that will convert cellulosic biomass, trees and grasses and garbage, on into ethanol, it's damned hard to get the money out of the sources because they say, what are we doing this for? Why don't we wait for hydrogen?
That's very interesting. I think we should open it up. If anybody in the audience has a question, there's a microphone right here since we're all on videotape. And if you're comfortable doing so, it would be great to have you identify yourself and give your question. And if you want to direct it to a specific person, please do so. And I'm very conscious, one of the things we haven't talked about yet, so if anybody's interested in bringing it up, is, this whole notion of the old infrastructure and the centralized nature of much of what we do and how security threats have been so highlighted in the last 18 months. I think that this is a good group of people to kind of touch on some of that. So I would throw that out there, and we can touch on it anyway. But please, go ahead.
Bill, I want to cheer you on. I remember when we made Victory Gardens and helped each other around during World War II. I think your whole idea of a Manhattan Project is absolutely right on. There's an installation of a water turbine that does not require dams in South Korea right now, with a plan by the Korean government to make a 90 megawatt power plant from a 10 knot current going by, because the land has been so valuable in South Korea that they don't want to bother to expand their nuclear facilities. I have been working in Vermont on a project to try and deal with waste. And I've just talked with some people in New York at Columbia Chemistry Department who are trying to make the quality of water in the Hudson River useful for swimming. I traced the water right up through Lake Champlain into northern Vermont, almost to Canada, with fertilizers and insecticides causing a change in the ecology of the whole stormwater system all the way down the way, causing zebra mussels to grow in Lake Champlain, and taking these materials all the way down to New York City. What intrigues me about this is that we have found that there is value in fossil fuels to help the agricultural industry, but we've also found that our overuse of them and our lack of scientific care about them has created the abuses which we're trying to suffer with and deal with. And they are huge, respecting our health systems, our transportation systems, our energy systems, and our waste systems. I want to suggest that there's an economic issue here, which is that the degradation of the value of oil, which has been maintained by the military complex, is impeding looking at the ways in which we can produce other alternatives by making money at it. And the problem with our energy system right now, our electrical system right now, is the grid, which is so worn down and hard to carry power in many places, because we have spent the last 50 years discouraging a reinvestment in the grid. So if we take low-cost means of producing energy, like Hull's wind machine, which is half the energy it would spend buying it from the grid, or we use a turbine like this, which allows us to produce this at a lower cost, we can cause an investment in the grid which can reshape our security and our health.
What do you make of that? Do you want to respond?
I couldn't agree more with some of the things you're talking about. I mean, this gets into the area of what I would be seeking win-win opportunities across the board. Hydropower catches a lot of criticism because of sort of our old thinking about hydropower. Lowhead, tidal basin, run-of-river systems need to be looked at again. We have a feature of biomass which is associated with having a positive impact on local regional economies, which we should really carefully look at. Wind power, as good examples. We have a big experiment going on now in the so-called Cape Wind project. It'll be interesting to see if that gets deployed at the scale that they're talking about. Siting wind turbines, I live near Hull. I agree with you. It's a great thing to see, but putting up hundreds of these in certain locations will be challenging. There is an inherent sort of fear, I think, of changing the visual landscape sometimes, even if it makes sense renewably. So this will be an interesting one to follow.
Thanks for bringing up the point about chemical fertilizers and pesticides. If we're going to go through a major increase in biofuels and bioelectricity and bio-based products, we've got to go through the process of ensuring that we're farming in a proper way and greatly reduce the amount of chemical fertilizers and pesticides.
My name is John Camella. I'm an unemployed software engineer. Several of you have mentioned energy efficiency, but I haven't heard energy conservation. I heat my house and provide hot water with 380 gallons of heating oil a year. When I plug the numbers for my house into the online surveys, it comes up to 99%, the head of 99% of the other people that have done that. I got here in a GeoMetro that gets 40 miles to a gallon. I think the problem is that energy is simply too cheap.
Yeah, exactly.
My wife and I fight about my energy conservation at home. She wants to crank up the thermostat, and of course that isn't efficient. So I had her to pay for the oil. But given that it's 380 gallons a year, she says, I'm paying for it, I can do whatever I want.
Should we have Jeff Tester address this a little bit? Because I think what he pointed out before, trying to get the value of it to match reality.
Right. Part of this is again, it strikes on the personal value system that you have. I share those values. As some people know, certainly my students know well, I advocate trying to have efficiency in terms of a home. I think buildings are a neglected sector of the sort of energy equation in many places around the world, particularly the U.S. We love to have large houses, and in most cases we can do much, much better in terms of issues like combined heat and power within a house, stationary fuel cells, small distributed energy systems, the capturing of solar energy, the use of bioenergy, geothermal heat pumps we've heard, really create an incentive for a new paradigm, I think, for buildings in the country. And unfortunately, we drive all of these by local codes. We really need a national policy, I think, on building performance, and one that incentivizes, if you will, to use a difficult word, the people adopting these. Perhaps it could be mortgages that would favor, lower rate mortgages that favor ultimate high efficiency homes. We've seen a few hopeful things. There's Energy Star homes now, there are Energy Star appliances, but there's a long way we could go. In fact, the paradigm in my view is a zero net energy house, where then over the course of the year you could capture as much energy as you actually consume. So if you had photovoltaics and some of these other devices, you could be selling some of it back during high levels of capture and using some of it during times when you needed it. But we don't really have this kind of policy in place. And that is what I would address, as the idea of we're not aggressive enough when it comes to this. We could do a lot more in the energy efficiency area. Chris talked about this earlier, for sure, and I fully endorse that. Certainly automobiles and cars and vehicles are another way. Conservation sometimes is assumed by many to mean sacrifice, a synonym for sacrifice. It doesn't have to be that at all. We can have the same performance or even higher performance in a more efficient system that actually conserves resources. But we have to do this in let's say, in a way that looks at the whole system and not just one component. You look at your whole house and the total energy bill, and I do the same thing. So that's a good point.
Well, we could ask, I guess, how many people drove an SUV to get here?
Right. As long as they brought 6 people
it would
with them,
probably
they're all right.
be about half. The issue is, and we think the gasoline isn't cheap because it's up to $1.75 a gallon in Europe.
I think that's a good. Sorry to interrupt, but can we very briefly just address that? I mean, is he right that energy is too cheap, and if it were more expensive or taxed, does that actually lead to conservation?
With respect to vehicles alone, or
or houses, or I mean, are
you
there
still have to
comparisons?
heat your house. Not everybody might be willing to go down to 45 degrees or so. So, fuel oil, I checked with my company this morning because I need a little bit more. It's up to $2 a gallon now, just over the course of, and that has very little tax on it, by the way, relative to. So I'm not totally convinced it would completely change the pattern of consumption in this country, but it certainly would be a wake-up call for our economy to a certain extent. An overnight transition to a very big change of tax structure, similar to what we have in Europe, would not probably be a good idea for the economy right now. But a gradual change and a shift that favors higher performance vehicles in some way. There are other ways to do it besides necessarily penalizing everyone for it. Should be looked at, and it's not looked at aggressively enough, I would say. So I agree with you. It's a tough one. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm looking at the long line of people behind you. I'll try to be better about moving people along. If you can keep it short and punchy, and we'll try to do the same on the panel.
Okay, I think a lot about electricity supplies, and one of the things I see is 30-40% a year growth in wind power. If I remember correctly, the peak wind power capacity added in the world the last couple of years has been comparable to that added for nuclear or coal, possibly even greater. And I read about you can take the wind power resource in the Great Plains, and that's about equal to the entire electric consumption in the United States. And I read something else very recently that says, well, most of that's not terribly usable, maybe because it's far from transmission lines, and maybe there's a lot less resource, and maybe we can only get 20% of our needs 30 or 40 years from wind because the resource is just limited. And I wondered if you had thoughts or comments on those.
Who's our wind expert?
I can make a quick response on that. You're right about the growth rates, and I think we're going to see wind become a major part of the electric power system in this country very shortly. It is already above 20% in some areas of Europe, having done that in a period of only about 10 years in some cases to go from zero to that level. There's a very interesting dynamic with that industry now. It's growing so rapidly. It's about an $8 billion a year industry growing at over 30% a year. That's creating tremendous additional money to be reinvested. The scale of the production is going up all the time. The costs are already less expensive than coal-fired generating capacity in many instances. And you're certainly right that there are issues like the need to build new transmission capacity and other things that will need to be addressed over time. But I think there's a dynamic underway, including a real economic and political momentum behind wind now that I think virtually guarantee that you're going to see it become a major part of the electric power system in this country. I wouldn't be surprised within 20, 25 years it actually passes hydropower as a share of our electricity supply.
Thank you. Next.
It's also important to recognize that wind is a second crop for many farmers.
My name is Jonathan Nickerson. I'm with a company called Ecology and Environment, where I design environmental management systems for existing buildings. My question tonight is involving electric vehicles and sort of their future. The point was made earlier that basically the military-industrial complex and energy companies, to a certain degree, will design our future. They have a large role in the future. And it also made the point that it has to come from the bottom up if we really want to see change. My question is involving the fact is yesterday General Motors announced they're pulling the plug, if you will, on EV1 project, their electric vehicle, saying that the public wasn't ready for it. They were not willing to plug a vehicle in every 100 miles, and various other reasons it was unpopular. That to me is the bottom up type of thing. It's not coming from the top down. If that is indeed the case, do we have to face that same issue with future alternative fuel vehicles, or is there some other aspect behind the scene type of thing that we aren't seeing as the general public? It's not reported in the news, but there are other facets perhaps. And do those come into play when we look at other alternative fuel vehicles in the near future?
I was just in California and had a chance to talk with the head of the California Air Resources Board, Alan Lloyd, and that's the regulatory agency in California that's really driven the electric vehicle market. They put the mandate in place. Northeastern states tried to follow it. And what he indicated to me, and he basically is supporting what's going on, is that the auto industry has basically shifted gears now away from the idea of battery-driven cars towards hybrid vehicles and towards fuel cell vehicles. And I think that we're in the early stages of the biggest change in automotive technology that's occurred since Henry Ford introduced the Model T, literally. And these are electric cars. Fuel cell vehicles are electric cars. They have, in fact, the one that GM has developed has an electric motor on each wheel. There's virtually no moving parts in the entire vehicle. And the shift that has occurred is that it's just generally, I think, accepted at this point that batteries have such a long ways to go that the better way to get there in terms of the efficiency and the cleanliness of an electrical system is to initially pursue hybrids, but a lot of the technology that goes into hybrids is also applied then to a fuel cell vehicle, which is simply another form of electrical vehicle where rather than trying to store the energy in the form of a chemical battery, you're storing it in the form of hydrogen.
If you put an ethanol engine in a hybrid electric, you get about 300 miles per gallon equivalent oil.
Can you stop talking about ethanol, Bill?
There's one thing to keep in mind.
I want you to start promoting solar energy.
There are, again, a whole series of sort of win-win things that go along with putting out a platform of more efficient vehicles. Regenerative braking, lower weight materials, getting people to buy into driving smaller vehicles, using the engine system with a recovery system that would, by the way, probably involve a combination of batteries, flywheels, other systems that allow you to accelerate when you need to. So I think that these early experiments, like any kind of engineering system, you learn from those. And I think EV was not really, it had a lot of the attributes you'd want in a car. It didn't have the range. The electricity had to come from somewhere. And so by going to these hybrids, I think we're going to see a much more robust and I believe more popular platform. Eventually, markets will have to determine this. Policies can go a little ways, but it'll be whether people really want to drive these things. And I think we shouldn't forget that there are other attributes in the equation. Safety is a big deal. And these new vehicles are going to have to prove themselves to be as safe or at least comparable in safety to the existing set we have now.
What's the issue there, that they're lighter?
Well, lighter and smaller, but I don't think that's a problem right now. I mean, we've seen the vehicles that have cut. Certainly Toyota is way ahead of us in many ways in terms of the platform of using its existing kind of vehicles, Corolla and now Camry and things like that, that certainly have managed to survive quite well in today's market. So I think that will be accomplished. It's just the idea that all of the world wants to drive in an SUV forever is probably not going to really happen in the long run here. We can maybe get away with downsizing some of these things to the point where you can still have what you're looking for, but just do it in a much more efficient fashion. This is the same analog to the buildings issue. Just transport the same sort of paradigm to automobiles. Yep.
Okay.
Good
Thank
question.
you for your question.
Hi, Andrew Stern, and I have some background in both electric cars. When I was in college, I went to Worcester Polytech, and I raced in the first GM Sun Race. Hand-built solar panels out of Billerica, Massachusetts, at a place called Mobile. Yep. Okay. In '89.
No, Exxon, right?
Well, perhaps.
I read part of Exxon.
Valdez, what have you. And all I'm getting at for that particular project, and again, this was back in 1990. Mobile had a very functioning, and I don't know who owns it now, 24-hour-a-day manufacturing plant, et cetera, et cetera. So these oil companies or whatever, they're energy companies, and until we determine as a public, in a public sort of sense that, non-polluting, zero-emission type of energy gathering is the way to go. It's not going to get there. That's that. And the other thing is with wind power, I have had the fortune of working with, if Malcolm, can you just raise your, Malcolm Brown out of the Hull project. Great project. And great project. I'm curious of other projects besides Princeton. I heard someone mention that Massachusetts had other projects. But that would be interesting to me if there are other projects that are at least
Cape
slated.
Wind off there, yeah.
But Cape Wind, is that up and running?
Not up and running, but it's
but long and short of it, I do have the answer to our energy problems, and it's knowledge and it's information. And with that, I'd like to invite you all to Hull tomorrow.
Right.
There is a water shuttle leaving the Marriott Long Wharf at 5 o'clock, and it takes you right to the base of the turbine. And we'll be more than happy. For those who can't make it, we've got handouts and a website. So if you'd like to see me afterwards, certainly come grab a handout.
Great. Thanks for the info.
Hello. My name is Joseph Zelak. I'm from central New Jersey. I'm in the process of retrofitting a two-family house. I heard geothermal with the heat pump mentioned a couple times, and it wasn't elaborated on. Can anybody elaborate upon it a little bit more?
What's happened in the heat pump area, a typical an old sort of, let's say, first generation type heat pump was an air-to-air type system, which could be used for air conditioning or heating. It doesn't work so well in terms of its efficiency, or the metric that's used is a coefficient of performance, which is the relative ratio of the heating or cooling capacity relative to the units of electricity that have to come in. So when that number exceeds about 3, you're in great shape, because you're getting a very highly efficient system. The typical coefficients of performance that you can achieve in a geothermal system, which is either ground source heat or groundwater supplied for both air conditioning and heating, is in excess of 4 now, and very reliable. In other words, long sort of warranty given. You can buy these. There are companies now that will install these. There's been a great growth in geothermal heat pump systems in the Midwest and in the southern tier states that have also a high AC load as well as heating. But there's no reason why it wouldn't function quite well in New England, and I'd be happy to give you a couple of websites where you can find all you want to about this.
Thank you. I'll talk to you later.
Great.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'd like to answer to that, too. I see my good friend Drew Gillett over to the right here, and on the NESE chat site, Drew is quite outspoken on the subject of ground source heat pumps, and I tend to agree with him. One thing you have to look at is whether this is being used in new construction or old construction.
Right.
And part of the thing is the original EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute papers that came out about a decade or more ago, said if you have a drafty old farmhouse with a large backyard, this is the thing for you. Unfortunately, what the utilities have begun to do is to take new Energy Star homes, which are very efficient, and place ground source heat pumps in them. The basic rule of thumb that is used is the more efficient the shell, less important is the efficiency of the unit heating it. Think of it this way. If you have a drafty old farmhouse that uses 2,000 gallons of oil, a 10% efficiency gain is 200 gallons. If you have a new house that in total only uses 200 gallons, a 10% gain is merely 20 gallons. Therefore, why spend huge amounts of money that put huge amounts more on your mortgage to get a gain of 20 gallons?
Okay. Well, we could debate the particulars. I think you really, the retrofitting issue is a real important one. You know, if you have an air system right now in your house, doing the retrofit is going to be relatively easy. If you have a hot water or pressurized water or steam system, I'd like to talk to you more. That's going to be a problem. But in new construction, I'd like to. I think we have to go over the numbers because they have to be looked at carefully.
I see a debate after.
Okay.
We'll go to the next question.
All depends on the cost of the system.
Sounds like a good question.
Well, from a practical position, I just noticed about last winter that the home of the National Defense University and the War College, they went around the clock for about 3 months retrofitting all the buildings to groundwater heat pumps. So there's got to be something to the retrofit too.
I think the AC load is a real big issue here because you're not just burning oil for AC. So,
I think Bush's ranch in Crawford has one of these systems as well. So they are doing some good things.
I just want notice I didn't mention ethanol.
I owe you a beer. So.
And you still haven't answered his dig about subsidies.
Yeah, well, we can't cover everything tonight. Maybe
Fred.
we should continue with the questions, right?
One of the things that this whole forum was advertised to talk about is the issue of national security. Right. And we've really done a great job here tonight on the energy side. I've got a question that I'd like Jeff and Chris to debate. If you think we had a good debate there about ground source heat pumps, I think we have an even better one about the question of where nuclear power might fit into the security equation. And in a couple particular instances, one, the obvious question of we're theoretically going into Iraq because of potential nuclear weapons. Anybody that reads the news, it seems like we've already lost the war with North Korea because they've already got the nukes, because part of the deal we made with them was we were going to give them these supposedly clean nuke plants that they're getting the uranium out of them anyway. And then the final obvious question is if that plane that crashed into the Pennsylvania woods had crashed into the cooling ponds with the spent fuel rods at 3 Mile Island instead, what would the impacts have been? And I guess, for somebody at a place like MIT, you guys have a lot of influence, and if you look at a little technical question like, is this a good energy resource? Well, yeah, maybe. But if you look at the larger questions of, by encouraging institutions like MIT and institutions like General Electric to proliferate uranium to places like North Korea and Iraq, and then when you further just have spent fuel floating around in places like Pennsylvania and Connecticut, what's the national security implications of that? And I think I'd like both Chris and if you'd maybe start since you're the nuclear advocate.
And you can answer that. I mean, we should look at that question even before we talk about adding nuclear. I mean, we have that question right now, right?
Well,
I mean,
yeah. What are we going to do about the high levels of risk, not only in this country but around the globe, and especially in these unstable dictatorships? And maybe talk about the whole national security issues generally a little bit more.
Do you want to start, Chris, or?
Well, certainly outside of a few defense facilities, the nuclear power plants which we have in this country are the most vulnerable terrorist targets, and there's certainly been a great effort that's been underway for the last year and a half to try to strengthen the security around those. I think the interesting question to look at with nuclear power is, we're all concerned about proliferation today. I think it's widely recognized that proliferation of nuclear materials and technologies is something that the world has not taken as seriously as it needed to. Where would we be today if the nuclear industry had not collapsed 25 years ago, and the dreams of many people, many governments had come to fruition? Rather than having roughly 400 nuclear plants around the world, we had 5,000, 10,000. Those were the kinds of plans that were on the drawing board. It was assumed and it was envisioned that the International Atomic Energy Agency would actively promote the use of nuclear power in all developing countries, and we would literally have nuclear plants in virtually every urban industrialized part of the world today. If you think we've got a nuclear proliferation problem on our hands today, imagine where we would be. And Iraq, of course, is a very interesting example, because Iraq had plans that were endorsed by the international community to have dozens of nuclear plants in place, as did Iran. Now, Iraq involuntarily canceled its nuclear construction program thanks to a couple of Israeli F-15s that eliminated that. But there is, I think, you can work very hard. You can do a lot. There are a lot of things that you can do to encourage nuclear technologies that are less vulnerable to proliferation. Sure. That's the game that the Clinton administration was trying to play with the North Koreans, not terribly successfully. But I think the bottom line is that while some people may still regret it, we really dodged a much worse situation because the nuclear industry collapsed through a combination of public opposition and economic problems, cost overruns. But one of the things that we have been left with is a proliferation problem that is serious, but is a lot more manageable than it otherwise would be.
We could say a few more words about this. This is obviously a very complicated question and a good one. Certainly the areas of safety and proliferation and waste are the three things that are limiting, let's say, the expansion of nuclear power. But we also have to think about there are other problems out there that we might need to be concerned about. What we've done with what's happened with our trajectory, let's say, of not having all of our electricity provided by nuclear energy or other energy forms as well, we've evolved to a system where we're essentially dependent, at least in this country, on coal for most of the electric power that we have. If we get into a situation where carbon becomes very important, given the issues concerning not only the technical and economic viability of sequestration, but also the environmental concerns that might be associated with it, we may not have a lot of options. As much as the people around this table endorse renewables, and I'm certainly one of them, it may not be able to solve all of the energy supply demands that we have in this country. Keep in mind that we're still talking about a system that has 750,000 megawatts of generating capacity in the country. Even with the optimistic scenario for growth for other options, it still will take a long time to make that transition. We have about 110 or so reactors active in the country right now, and they have done much to improve their operating record and the economics associated with producing power. So I think it takes a careful look. These are trade-offs. They're important questions. The viability of our own economy depends on having is all spread around the country. There are 100 or so of them. But keep in mind there are other targets that could have just as big an impact on our energy supply system. Envision an event where one of the major refineries on the Gulf Coast area of Texas and Louisiana was hit with one of those airplanes. The one difference here is that we'd be talking about hundreds of thousands of barrels a day equivalent of refined product that could not be replaced overnight. It's not as simple as a problem of just repairing the Trans-Alaska pipeline with a short rupture in it, which in fact was done quite quickly, or even other parts of our infrastructure. These are big embedded plants that are vital right now to supplying fuel for the vehicles and for our economy. So there are lots of other areas that are vulnerable too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Fred,
good question.
Do you feel like they've begun to answer? Well, it was a very big meeting.
I'd like to just follow up, Jeff, if I could.
Sure.
My sense is that, I share some concerns about global warming, and I also feel that, while there would be a significant economic impact if a refinery got whacked,
well, it'd be disruptive to our supply.
It'd be very disruptive to energy, to the economy, and all that. But I can't help but think that in terms of scale and time frame, that a major radiation event and the panic and terror that would create would have to have a much larger impact on our economy, on our society, on our freedom, and everything else than either global warming or anything that anybody could do to the fossil fuel industry.
And there's actually a living experiment that occurred along these lines. Europe dominates the wind power industry today. It has 75% of the total capacity, almost all of which has been built in the last decade. We were far ahead of Europe in this area in the 1980s. And the single event that did the most to change the dynamics, to create political momentum that made all of this possible in Europe was the Chernobyl nuclear accident in '86 that had such an impact because people were directly affected by the radiation. They had to stop eating vegetables that had been, sitting out in the fields during that period. There was, a scare literally across Europe, which received extensive fallout. So there's a real sort of dynamics here, and I think, there's a tendency, and I respect the way Jeff, in his very academic way, presents these options. We got to look at every option, and everything has costs and benefits. But in the real world, there is a set of dynamics, and you're having complex democratic societies interacting with complex, hard to understand technologies. And there is politically a trade-off between nuclear and renewables. Nuclear was something that the entire world was committed to, basically up through the 60s. There was then a transitional period, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl. Opinions changed. The economics got out of control. Governments basically fought off renewables for a long time because they viewed it as a threat to something else that they put a higher priority on. That has now changed in Europe. Most European governments do not have any interest in pursuing nuclear power because they realize it's a political non-starter. It was the equivalent of the Republicans in Germany that controlled the parliament, that pushed the renewable energy laws forward against the strong opposition of the utilities that were heavily invested in nuclear. So this is the dynamics of where we're headed. There is a lot of political momentum behind renewables now. There is very little political momentum behind nuclear. I certainly agree that if someone completely reinvents the technology, cuts the cost by 2/3, eliminates the proliferation problem, makes it completely safe, you might see a nuclear future. At that point, I don't think you could hardly call it nuclear power.
Can you just very, 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 very quickly, I want to get to these questions, but we have had a bit of a wake-up call on September 11th, right? I mean, has anything in the last 18 months, especially when Fred brings up the image of the nuclear power plant, if the plane had gone there instead of the Pentagon or the Trade Center towers, I mean, has anything changed in terms of money spent on security or a decision to close down plants? Or, I mean, I don't know what it would be, but it's hard to believe there's been no change.
I think the main result is in terms of investment and security. I think most nuclear plants are a good deal better protected than they were. There's not been a wave of shutdowns. There were not any plants that were under construction or even planned, so there really wasn't anything to change in that area.
Okay. I have been remiss. There's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of you, 7, and about 15 minutes. So we'll just whiz through. Maybe we'll just have one panelist answer each question. And I apologize, but we'll all be here after, and feel free to come up and chat and pursue. Anyway.
Scott Greenbaum. I'd like to make one comment. I've driven a hybrid car, and its performance is equivalent to any other car. There might be a little bit of a scaling problem to SUVs. I have, in the security issue, an opposite to deal with. Let's say that we did get the political will and we were able to reduce our oil consumption, fossil fuel consumption by 50% or so over the next decade or so. How would that affect the Middle East? Because now we would take away an enormous part of their revenue streams. We would drive the price of oil down below $5 again, and they would be broke. What are the risks on that end of the world, of that scenario?
Part of the way to do that, I mean, to bring it down that way is difficult. One has to understand that when OPEC, and not just the Middle East when I say that, but OPEC maintains discipline, they base their oil pricing policy on 2 things. The first point, and this is according to Daniel Yergin's book, The Prize. This was in the book. He said basically they keep it high enough to meet their revenue stream, but they always, and this is the important part for us, they always keep it low enough to prevent those alternatives from developing in the West. So that's the power of a cartel. And all they'd have to do is the minute we started to, unless we got the political will, as you said, but we're not going to, because political will is driven by economics. And so they'll keep lowering that price and producing, while they have the swing amount to be able to produce, to make those ventures go bankrupt?
I think the answer to your question is seen in the way these countries actually behave in international processes. They've been actively engaged in fighting against the Kyoto Protocol. There's an organized bloc of oil-producing countries. Amazingly, the U.S. at the Kyoto negotiations is basically on the same side of the room as Iraq and Libya, battling against our opponents, which are countries like Japan and the European Union and so on. They were also very active in the OPEC countries, that is, in joining with the U.S. in defeating the renewable energy provision that was to be in the World Summit agreement that came out of Johannesburg last summer. So clearly they have a dependence on oil. They're very reluctant to move in a new direction. The Saudis don't seem to be impressed by the vast solar resources that they have above their deserts, as well as the oil that's beneath them. I think at the end of the day, if they plan their future in a strategic way, they're not going to have a problem making a transition. Oil is not going to disappear overnight, and in fact, they should do what BP is doing. BP announced a couple of years ago that it doesn't stand for British Petroleum anymore. It stands for Beyond Petroleum. They're going to become a broader energy company. I think that the OPEC countries badly need to diversify their economies for a whole variety of reasons.
Okay. Next.
My name's Tim Dolan, and I just also wanted to state that a lot of this discussion has concentrated on transportation when most of it, I think, should have been taking care of the whole energy security policy of the U.S., which seems to mandate a more distributed energy source. That being said, every community in this country has a sewage plant, and they're in and of itself is a source of power. It's not a whole lot. It will not suffice all of our needs, but it is another source of energy. Another source which we have on this planet is ocean energy. And nowhere in this discussion has anybody brought up that possible, very viable source of energy. This country in and of itself has close to 5,000 miles of coastline, and 3/4 of the world is covered with it. Has anyone in your background pursued ocean energy, and how viable of a resource is it? Thank you.
That'd be great, Jeff.
Well, let's tackle the first part of the question too. I think we have focused a little bit certainly on transportation because it is a big part of the total equation. We did mention some issues about buildings, and certainly electric supply is a big issue. Now, when you talk about the distributed nature of energy, I mean, this is a multi-scale problem as well. It's across a lot of scales. We have 400,000 miles of natural gas pipelines in the country right now. We have over 100,000 miles, certainly, of electric transmission lines. We're distributing energy all over the place. But we don't necessarily do it, I think, in the way your question is getting at, which is focusing more on, say, smaller communities, individual buildings, and the like. That could be set by performance standards and by local codes as well as national codes to improve that, as I mentioned to the earlier question we had. And it's not done right now. So it's an opportunity. Also, closing loops in other areas where we now are, let's say, disposing of waste, particularly biologic sewage sludges, agricultural waste. This all gets to the issue of, can you do this economically at some scale? And I think that we should bear in mind that although I may be accused of being an academic, we have a long time to progress to this transition too, Chris. And I'm optimistic about what's going on right now in the area of biology in particular, and the connection between biology and engineering, which by and large, for at least the recent time, has been focused primarily on health. And I think once we start to change that somehow and start to focus some of it on energy and the connection of the energy content, let's say, of some of these biological materials, I think we will see some change, some significant change. So landfill gas could become yet another biofuel source. There's also a lot of other residual wastes, one of which I'm quite familiar with now is the area of food processing waste. Roughly half of the food that we process is eventually thrown out. And there's a big energy content there, some of which could be used for oil. So it may not solve the whole problem, but it certainly is a more sustainable approach, and I heartily endorse that. And I think the economics in the long run could make sense. But we need to restructure the systems that we have right now in place. They don't address that kind of diverse, distributed nature, and it can be done.
Great.
In terms of human waste and animal manure, it may be crap to you all, but at biomass, guys, it's energy and chemicals.
Right.
What about the ocean?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you're talking about the ocean in terms of wave power or the tidal aspects of the ocean, but certainly let's cover it all. There's thermal, there's waves, and there's the tidal aspect. The tidal aspect certainly is being looked at in terms of this Korean initiative that you heard about. Also in the Cape Cod Canal, we have some interesting experiments going on low head sort of tidal flow energy recovery. So that is being looked at. It's not being aggressively, pursued at a level that would be comparable to some of the other forms, but certainly out there. Ocean thermal would probably not be very viable for most of the coastline that we have, with the exception perhaps of Hawaii or places like that, or in the southern climes where we've got very higher temperatures. But that's a pretty small temperature difference for generating a lot of power. It might have other attributes to it that could be useful for fish farming and things like that, that's ocean farming. Wave power, though, is an interesting one that I think has been not maybe looked at aggressively enough. There was a big surge of interest in England back in the 70s and early 80s, and that needs to be looked at. Again, it's how do you collect all this energy with these sort of devices that you'd have out in a wave motion thing. And I think there's some opportunity for creative work there. But to my knowledge, it's certainly not on the current agenda of the DOE's portfolio. There may be individual entrepreneurs around that are looking at it. Yeah.
Jeff, I think
an important part of the current British proposal.
British, right. Yeah, the British they've been the world leaders in this, and we know there's a heck of a lot. Yeah.
I'm just going to say, I don't mean to interrupt or be rude at all. I think some of the more technical questions I think that people have come up afterwards and chat with people here. And I really apologize because you guys have been sitting there a long time, but it's 9 o'clock. You're standing, so you get your last question. We'll have a very quick answer. And then I'm going to ask each of the panelists just in 1 or 2 sentences to sum up, and if you're thinking exchange over the course of the evening, whatever, what's the most urgent priority in terms of energy and national security? If you could sit down with President Bush or whatever, but please go ahead first.
Well, it is getting late, and I think this might be brief because another attendant asked the nuclear question, or nuclear question, whichever it may be. My name is David Shore. I'm a resident of Arlington. I came here by public transit, took the T, and I should have had a backup question, I suppose, but I think the part of the nuclear question that I didn't hear answered was kind of like a national psychology thing and also a safety thing. And I'm familiar with the French situation. I don't know if America wants to emulate France, but the French, I think, I think most of their power comes from nuclear. I think they're exporting electricity. Right. I've also read that something like 30,000 years of life human lifetimes are lost every year from fossil fuel burning, coal, and carbon, and the pollution that gets into the atmosphere. And I also heard a comment about Chernobyl, which occurred in a country that I don't think at the time valued safety like the French do and like other countries do.
Just try to frame the question.
My question is what is it about our like national psychology or what the public understands about nuclear power that kind of interferes with our ability to embrace it? And I also have to say that I don't necessarily find it to be like a warm, fuzzy kind of source, but it's interesting. And
I have a very simple answer to that, which is that it's because we believe in the market, and nuclear power is 3 times as expensive as the technologies that are dominant in the marketplace today. I mean, we used to be in a situation where the government could push any kind of energy technology it wanted, regardless of the market. That ended after the economic problems of the 70s and 80s. Nuclear power is simply not economically competitive in the market today. And yes, you could get back and have the government put another $100 billion into it, as occurred in the 60s and 70s, and try to restart the industry. But the private sector really does not have a big interest in investing in the technology at this point. So I think it's really, as someone once said, an incurable attack of market forces that did in the nuclear industry. It wasn't, Jane Fonda and a few anti-nuke groups that finished it off.
Thanks. I think, do you have a really short question? And we'll give you a really short answer. But then I think you guys should come up afterwards, and we need to end. So go ahead.
Alex von Braun, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Could anyone comment on the relative effectiveness on changing petroleum use habits of Americans of CAFE standards versus, say, gas taxes?
Anyone want to take a one-sentence answer stab at that? Yeah, I think you need both, really. I mean, the auto companies have a point that unless people are going to have an interest in buying the vehicles that they're producing, they're going to have a problem. So I think there's a need both for higher fuel taxes. We have ridiculously low fuel prices compared to most of the rest of the world. But I do think that the government has a proper role in guiding the auto industry in the right direction to steer the long-term investment that's needed in greater fuel economy.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm really sorry to cut you guys off. Please come up afterwards. I'm going to ask, starting with Joel, just please give a sense of where you'd like to go from here. And remember, energy and national security, as some people have pointed out, we focus a lot on energy and not so much on national security.
Yes, okay, I'll try to, for my concluding statement, if I were with President Bush, I would say, President Bush, right now we have a very vulnerable centralized system. As your legacy, what you should do is at least begin the transition to a decentralized system using distributive systems, using an energy mix that is not over-reliant on any one source, and give us the resilience we need, not just for energy security reasons, but every time there's an ice storm that clobbers either New England or North Carolina, that it is not going to do untold damage to the economy.
Chris Flavin?
I think we have an extraordinary opportunity right now. The forces of market change, technological change, and even political change, I think, are lining up in a way that we could go into a period of very rapid change in the energy system comparable to what happened 100 years ago. I know it doesn't feel like that given the level of discussion in Washington, given what we're facing in the Persian Gulf and so on. But I do think that if you look at what's actually happening out there in the real world, it's coming together in a very interesting way. And I think that the role of the government is not to completely direct the process, not to steer it with a government R&D program. I understand the sort of emotion that leads people to call for a Manhattan Project or Marshall Plan scale of effort, but I think the analogy is not a good one. I think that this revolution, like the earlier energy revolution 100 years ago, can and will be led by the market, by communities, by individuals. I think that government has a leadership role that it's not now playing in terms of getting the prices right, in terms of getting the regulatory systems shifted in a new direction in the power industry, in terms of a number of things related to taxes and financing. But I don't think that we're leading ourselves in a promising direction to think that it's going to be made and led in Washington and that government R&D is going to take us where we need to go.
Bill Holmberg?
Well, if I had a chance to spend some time with the President, the first thing I would do is bring Jeff and Chris and Joel along with me to do the good talking. But I do think we need a Manhattan Project, but I agree with Chris, it's not going to come from the top down. It's just too complicated. I've worked at both the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency for a number of years, and it won't come from there. It's got to come from the states, the communities, and the American people. You simply have to grab that, wrap yourself in the flag and be a patriot and get out there and do it.
Jeff Tester.
U.S. leadership, to me, is the key to this, and I agree with what Chris is saying. The government should be an active participant. It shouldn't be expected to do it all. But there's a lot that it could do to help build our own capacity and the diversity of that supply system. The scale from invention or discovery, let's say, to deployment is a big one, fit with many difficult paths. And if MIT is a lot about the next generation of scientists and engineers, and I haven't heard much said tonight about that. And I'd like to leave you at least with that thought, that that's one area that government could focus on, perhaps more than it is right now, namely the next generation of people that we're going to need in this coming century as we move through it to produce the deployable, workable systems. So in a sense, I kind of underscore the idea that we should be investing more, and it's not just money, it's policies as well, associated with increasing our options rather than decreasing them, which is the path we're on now. Thank you.
Thank you all very much, panelists and public alike.